No nice way of saying this. The rand is being pummeled by the strong dollar, and economists are saying the power crisis is fueling negative investor sentiment against South Africa. Let's bring in the experts. Azar Jammine, of course, the Director and Chief Economist at Econometrix this morning. Azar, I really appreciate your time. Yes, blackouts, but I want to just ask this. Maybe we just get this out the way. How damaging has the comments and the allegations by the U.S. ambassador been for our currency against the dollar? Good morning.
Good morning to you, Gareth, and to the viewers. I think the report of South Africa possibly being implicated in selling arms to Russia is extremely damaging and for the rand, and I think actually explains why the rand has fallen by around 5% over the past week or so. The rand was already on the back foot due to load shedding and the negative implications that load shedding would have on economic growth. And if economic growth was going to be even weaker than anticipated, this has the implications that tax revenue growth will be weaker than anticipated, which means that government's budgets would have been too optimistic, and we will have to borrow more money to fund government spending than we previously believed would be the case. So the public debt level will rise by more than anticipated. And that in itself jeopardizes our credit ratings outlook and is seen as cause for weakness in the currency. But in the past few days alone, there has been a remarkable further weakening in the rand from around 1820, 1830 to 1920, 1930 to the dollar. And one suspects that that is due to the fact that some in the know in the United States were aware of what has been going on and have been selling off South African government bonds and South African shares and pulling their money out of South Africa.
It's worrying when you start talking, Azar, when you bring up the number like 1930, 1934 to the US dollar as well, because if I recall correctly, those are numbers we haven't seen since the early days of the COVID-19 crisis as well, when our rand also took a bit of a hit against the US dollar. Yeah. How do we, because a lot of this has got to do with sentiment, doesn't it? It's all how markets react is sentiment. Who's saying what, who isn't saying what, and when are they saying it, and to who? How do we try and change the sentiment? Is there anything we can do as a country? If the president, for example, came out now and was more positive or had concrete action against the blackouts, or he came out and said what actually happened with this Russian ship, would that change the sentiment? Is it as easy as that?
I think it would change the sentiment, at least temporarily. You've got to remember that the rand is fundamentally weak, basically for other reasons. I mentioned the one about load shedding and implications for lower economic growth. Secondly, the world is worried that the global economy is going to go into a slowdown in the wake of the sharp rise in interest rates that have occurred. And so certain key commodity prices have been falling. In particular in South Africa, prices of coal, palladium and rhodium that had been increasing very sharply, especially following the Ukrainian outbreak of the Ukrainian war. They've come tumbling back down again, which means that our exports are not doing as well as they were doing last year. And thirdly, the country was grey listed in February, which means that it is now being accused of not doing enough to fight money laundering. And as a consequence, there's going to be lots more checks and balances for any financial flows into and out of the country from now onwards. And that is inimical to the desire of investors to put money into the country.
Let's just circle back a second, Dr. Jammine, as we take a look at the dollar at the moment. Also, we're seeing the main currencies. Not sure if you can see them, but this, you know this off the back of your head. So let me remind viewers. So currently, the dollar 19.23. It's moving very, very quickly. The euro now pushing through 21 to the euro as well. It was hovering around 20.90, 20.95. The pound also now. We've pushed through 24 there. But on the US dollar issue, do you get a sense, Doctor, that there was an earlier suspicion there was going to be a problem with the rand from the US side? Was there anything you're hearing, seeing, suspecting that the Americans may have known, which started this little slip down towards us flirting with 19 to the US dollar, because we've been hanging around there for a couple of days. Obviously, yesterday, the ambassador pushed us over 19 clearly. But do you get a sense there was something happening in the background with the US? They knew something or another?
I do get that sense. I cannot put my foot on it. I don't have any evidence for it. But the way in which the currency had moved ahead of this event suggests that there were some in the know who knew that this was going to pan out like this and who took advantage of the situation to get out of the rand position. And that's the very reason why you asked me, should your wife cash in the dollars that she might hold temporarily? And I'm saying, yes, I think it's a good time, because the rand is currently unbelievably cheap. It has not been as cheap as this since 2001. And that was a very temporary spike that we experienced, and the currency recovered quite strongly. At the moment, I mean, you know, you'll buy less with rands than you have done at any stage. You buy less with rands overseas than you have done at any stage. I mean, a simple cappuccino in Europe will now set you back the better part of well over 100 rand. It's that kind of situation.
Yeah.
The rand is worth very little, and that has to be of some support to our export industries. And at some point, nothing goes on forever. The currency is at its weakest in 22 years on a trade-weighted basis, and virtually weakest ever, if one can put it, other than for a very short period of time in 2001.
Yeah, I suppose it would be fair to call this a crisis. Dr. Jammine, just before I say goodbye to you, very briefly, for those watching at home who aren't necessarily interested in the geopolitics behind this, even though that's the trigger to where we are at the moment, inflation, interest rates. I imagine the SARB are going to have to react to this as well. They want to try and manage that inflation rate, which means, I imagine, the expected interest rate hike could perhaps be worse than we thought. Just very briefly as I say goodbye.
I think you're absolutely correct. There was very little doubt that they were going to raise the repo rate by 25 basis points in 2 weeks' time. But given the inflationary implications of this latest fall in the rand, they may well have to increase interest rates they may well decide to increase it by 50 basis points, or to increase by a further 25 basis points in July. And worse than that is the prices of a lot of key goods will rise further than we anticipated, the most important being food. And the man in the street, the poor, the unemployed are going to suffer as a consequence of this. I don't know that they actually recognize the link between ANC dalliances with Russia and the implications for food prices that they will have to bear.
Well, I think we're about to get a very tough lesson on how intricately those two are linked, aren't we? Dr. Azar Jammine, thank you as always, explaining so very nicely to make sense of why this is so important. Azar Jammine, of course, the Director and Chief Economist at Econometrix.